The other top story tonight is one you may not have heard as much about, but boy, does it matter. An unusual battle within conservative politics. This is Trump versus the Koch brothers, who impact many races with their huge funding operation. They've spent $500 million since 2012. Now, one of their aides clapping back at what they call Trump's divisiveness and lack of leadership. And it's not just talk. The Kochs also even breaking with their usual Republican endorsements to boost a Democratic senator, Heidi Heitkamp, in North Dakota. And their new video opposes Trump's trade policies.
We're seeing a rise in protectionism. They're doing whatever they can to close themselves off from the new. This is a natural tendency, but it's a destructive one.
Everything is personal with Trump, so he took this critique, which is basically about policy and his actual governance, as some kind of breach of friendship, and now he's calling them a joke. This feud did start back during the campaign.
I was surprised because I thought I was friends, Koch brothers. I thought I was their friend. The reason they want to not have me get elected is that I know the game better than any of them know it.
So is it possible another Clinton could be better than another Republican?
It's possible. It's possible.
It's possible. It's not something Trump ever wanted to hear. Now, on the left, Democrats have long talked about the corrosive influence of money in politics generally, and the specific way that groups like the Kochs, Democrats say, have been the astroturf under the Tea Party movement for their own separate economic goals.
The Tea Party was essentially funded by the billionaire Koch brothers family.
What you see is the slow erosion of American democracy. These people that are doing these things, the Koch brothers, they don't really fundamentally believe in democracy. I think the Koch brothers are a danger to America.
I'm joined now by the man you just heard, former Vermont Governor and DNC Chair Howard Dean, as well as former Trump campaign aide Sam Nunberg, now a senior advisor to Steve Bannon, who's also been critical of the Kochs. An important conversation and an intramural feud. Howard, you've been on this for a while. How do you view what's happening now, including that rare sliver where you and the Kochs might overlap? Because I think you also are supporting Democrat Senator Heitkamp's reelection.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't pay a lot of attention to the Kochs. I really, truly do believe they do not care about democracy, nor do I believe the 5 Supreme Court justices who voted to undermine Citizens United care about democracy. Our country is corrupted by big money, and the Kochs are the biggest of the big money. So, I really don't pay attention to what they're doing other than to watch out, because they do a lot of things that are not too honest. And I'm certainly not going to take sides. I think Heidi Heitkamp has been a fantastic senator. I have no idea why the Kochs are supporting her, but I think she ought to be reelected.
Well, sir, I'll push you a little before I go to Sam. You've paid enough attention to them to call them out, and they're spending hundreds of millions. So I take your point that they're in the background, but isn't part of the critique that you've been advancing for years that this is a problem they're in the background? And I suppose now it's interesting that they're trying to claim there's some third way or third lane in Trump conservatism.
Well, there's nothing conservative about the Kochs. What the Kochs do is what's good for the Kochs, period. End of discussion. So, there's not much I can do to fight somebody who spends $80 gazillion on politics, except to publicly say that they should be discredited, they should not be taken seriously. They have no fundamental interest in the future of our country, except as it applies to their wallets.
Sam?
Well, I agree with everything Governor Dean said, basically. If you look at this, the Kochs are coming out against this president because they don't like his trade policies. That is the sole reason. And to go with exactly what Governor Dean said, saying that the Kochs only care about their bottom line and their pocket, can you ask, I can't wonder what else they could have gotten from this president. They got a tax cut, which I can assure you raised my taxes. They've gotten all these regulations cut. And because some of the profits go, because the president is trying to reset the trade balance, whether or not they agree with it or not, this is what he was elected, they've decided to come out and say, we don't support this president. We're not going to necessarily support Republicans in this midterm. And vis-a-vis this midterm, Ari, as you know, because you cover it every night, this midterm is going to decide basically control of whether or not this president's going to be impeached, because there's going to be one interpretation
I thought you
of
were
the
going to
Mueller
say
report.
subpoena power. I mean, you don't know. No one knows what the Dems will do with subpoena power or what they'll find.
Okay, well, then it certainly is going to control, the House is certainly going to control subpoena power and oversight, and this White House will be greatly affected. So the Kochs will certainly not have the type of White House that would be able to function properly if they really did care about libertarian values. So with that said, this really shows what people like Steve Bannon and others, and Trump was arguing, and I can tell you this was one of the things we talked about early on with Trump, was how the Koch brothers, one, we're going to go against him, but number two, that the base of the Republican Party, much like the base of the Democrat Party on the other side, does not like this big money. The Kochs are whining because they don't like the president's trade policies.
So let me go to you, Sam, and then Howard. There does seem to be some overlap of agreement, and I think a lot of people would not expect that from both of you. But what you're both getting at is the idea. We showed the videos, we showed the Kochs, and by the way, they're welcome to come on the beat anytime. Their argument is that they are ideological on the right, and that's why they do things. Viewers have just heard Governor Dean and now you, Sam, say that's not true. They are just a corporate entity that is just doing what's good for their bottom line, but that doesn't sound good in politics. So they've built a faux or fake conservatism around that, a veritable candy shell, when the real action is in the Carmel Center, where all the money is being made. And I know, Sam, that's the kind of analogy that you and I can relate to, because right. I know you like that green room candy that I do. Is that right? Speak to that, and then Howard afterward.
Well, when you showed their ad was concerned with one issue. The issue was protectionism. So when the president is in a trade war right now, and he is in a trade war, particularly with China, if you look at the Koch supply line on energy, they can get hit on both sides vis-a-vis the tariffs that China puts on their imports and the tariffs that the president's going to put on Chinese imports. And this goes to, once again, it goes to big money in politics. And what I would say is, what have the Kochs not gotten policy-wise from this president that they could argue about? So now they're going to pretend as if this is ideological. They're basically acting like gluttonous pigs.
Howard?
I think Trump is wrong about protectionism. This is a mistake. It's going to catch up with us. It's going to eventually undo a great economic expansion that we've had since 2009. The merits of the argument may be with the Kochs, but the problem is the Kochs have no respect among people who think about the future of America at all. They've tried to buy their way into respectability by donating huge amounts of money to various causes, some of which are good. I happen to like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They get a ton of money from the Koch brothers. So the best thing to do is ignore the Koch brothers in the sense that don't pay attention to what their motives are. This is where I do agree with Sam. Their motives are to get more money for themselves. Do pay attention to the damage they're doing to the United States of America. We truly need, one of the reasons I think Brett Kavanaugh is a terrible idea for justice is we have got to undo Citizens United. The only way to do that is the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh will vote in the wrong way on that issue. That is a vote in favor of corruption of the United States government and democratic processes.
All right,
let me say this, Sam, because I'm almost out of time. I did want to get your reaction to your former mentor, Roger Stone, speaking out tonight, and one of his associates going into the Mueller grand jury box. Do you think that Roger is playing this right, and do you think that he faces any vulnerability as a potential target here?
Well, look, as I've said, Roger is a critical piece for Mueller's narrative. This is my view, to set up, let's say, the Watergate narrative, where you have all these associates vis-a-vis near the president making this as if this break-in, which is now the Russian hacking, involved or was connected to the president. What they are doing is they're going into Roger's personal finances. And so when Roger is indicted, unfortunately, I don't support it, you'll have some...
You expect him to be indicted?
Yes, I do. And you're going to have some broad charge that he was part of a conspiracy to defraud America, then backed up with a bunch of financial charges. And this would not have happened but for the special counsel. Let's see what happens. With that said, I hope that Andrew Miller continues to fight the decision he got all the way up to the Supreme Court, because it's a very important decision about whether or not the special counsel's office violates the Appointments Clause. I believe it does.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.